Taiwan Strait, July 2026. One Arleigh Burke destroyer, 110 miles of contested water, 8 days. Not a carrier, not a strike group. One hull. And on that hull, something the PLA had never tracked in the strait before. Helios, a 60-kilowatt directed energy weapon, a laser, operational, at sea, running the most politically visible transit in the Pacific. The question is not whether Stockdale could fight her way through. The question is why the Navy chose this hull, this weapon, this moment, and who exactly was supposed to be watching. Here is the paradox. The Taiwan Strait Transit is the most routine, non-routine mission the 7th Fleet runs. Destroyers and cruisers have been doing it for years, usually in pairs, always logged, always photographed by PLA maritime patrol assets within the first hour. The transit is designed to be seen. That is the point. Freedom of navigation, demonstrated in public, on a schedule Beijing can set a watch by. So why pair the Strait's most visible mission with the Navy's newest directed energy capability? Why send the laser to the one place in the Pacific that guarantees an audience? The move does not add up until the map tells you why it does. Stay with this. By the end, the choice of hull will tell you more about where the Navy thinks the next fight is going than any white paper published in the last 3 years. If you want the strategy behind the headline instead of the headline, subscribe to Blue Water. This is what the deployment actually means. To understand what Helios is doing in the Taiwan Strait, you have to understand the problem the PLA has been building for a decade. Not the missile problem, the swarm problem. The People's Liberation Army Navy has invested heavily in what strategists call the A2AD envelope, anti-access, area denial. The outer layer is ballistic missiles, the DF-21D and DF-26, designed to hold U.S. carriers at range beyond 1,000 miles. Those get most of the press. But the inner layer is where the tactical problem lives, and it is a problem that a 60-kilowatt laser is actually designed to solve. PLA surface and coastal forces have built a capability around small, cheap, proliferated systems, ISR drones that can fix a surface target and vector in strikes, fast attack craft in swarm configurations, and anti-ship cruise missiles that come in low and fast at the terminal phase. The calculus is not elegant, it is arithmetic. Put enough things in the air and on the water simultaneously, and you exhaust the magazine of any conventionally armed destroyer before the ship can generate enough defensive fires to survive. That arithmetic has a name in Navy planning circles, the magazine problem. For a decade, the answer has been SM-2 and SM-6, Phalanx CIWS, electronic warfare, and the hope that the defensive stack holds long enough. Those are expensive answers to cheap threats. An SM-6 costs approximately $4.3 million. A small ISR drone costs a few thousand. An incoming anti-ship cruise missile from a PLA coastal battery costs roughly $500,000 to $2 million per round, depending on the variant. The exchange ratio is not in America's favor at the tactical level. What is surprising about the Helios deployment is not the technology, it is the timing. The Navy has been working directed energy systems for 20 years. What changed is not the capability. What changed is the threat density. The PLA's drone inventory expanded faster than any public estimate projected in 2020. Satellite imagery of training facilities in Fujian province shows swarm launch infrastructure scaled to put dozens of ISR platforms airborne simultaneously in a straight-width scenario. One study from the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments estimated that a coordinated PLA strike in the strait could require a defending surface combatant to engage more than 30 simultaneous incoming contacts in under 4 minutes. At SM-6 prices, that is a $130 million defensive engagement. Per ship, per attack. Helios changes that calculus. Where a missile salvo once forced the carrier defense screen to burn through interceptors round by round, the directed energy system draws from the ship's own generators, the same power plant already turning the screws beneath the hull. At 60 kilowatts, Helios is not a ship killer. It will not stop a DF-21D ballistic missile in its terminal phase. The physics of directed energy at that engagement range and target hardness are not there yet. What Helios can do reliably in sea-state conditions that approximate the Taiwan Strait in summer is burn out the optics and sensor packages of a small ISR drone at distances out to roughly 2 to 3 kilometers. It can disable the guidance system of an incoming anti-ship cruise missile in its final approach window, the terminal phase, where the seeker head is exposed and the engagement geometry is predictable. And it can disable small fast attack craft propulsion and electronics at close range. Operators track each engagement as it closes on the radar scope. The laser fires, the target drops, the ship's power draw spikes for a fraction of a second, then steadies. The cost of that kill is measured in electricity, not ordnance. $1 versus $4.3 million. That is the asymmetry Helios introduces, and that is what Stockdale carried into the strait. But the choice of which hull carried Helios into the strait was not random, and that choice tells a different story than the weapon itself. USS Stockdale is an Arleigh Burke Flight IIA destroyer, not a Flight III. The Flight III, represented by USS Jack H. Lucas and subsequent hulls, carries enhanced radar, improved power generation, and greater integration margins for directed energy systems. It is the Navy's newest and most capable destroyer variant. To make a statement about directed energy capability, you put Helios on a Flight III and send it through the strait. Maximum capability, maximum signal. The Navy put Helios on a Flight IIA instead. That was deliberate, and it is the most important strategic signal of the entire deployment. A Flight IIA has been the workhorse of the surface fleet for more than 2 decades. There are more than 40 hulls in service. When you demonstrate Helios operating from a Flight IIA, you are not announcing a boutique experiment on an elite platform. You are announcing a fleet-wide upgrade path. You are telling Beijing that directed energy is not a next-generation capability that arrives in 15 years when the Flight III production ramp scales. You are saying it is a now capability, and the hulls that carry it are already at sea, numbered in the dozens. The message is not about Stockdale. The message is about every Flight IIA in the fleet. Put yourself on the map. The Taiwan Strait runs roughly 110 miles at its narrowest point, between the coast of Fujian Province and the island of Taiwan. The PLA has radar coverage from elevated positions on the Fujian coast that can track a surface combatant from entry to exit with continuous coverage. There is no stealth transit. Stockdale was painted on PLA radar from the moment she entered the strait's southern approach, near the Penghu Islands, to the moment she exited north toward the East China Sea. That coverage is the point. The transit is, by design, a performance. The audience is Beijing, and Beijing was watching every system Stockdale was running. PLA intelligence collection vessels, called AGIs in naval parlance, shadowed Stockdale throughout the transit. They were close enough to conduct electromagnetic intercepts of radar emissions, communications, and sensor signatures. Standard procedure. The Navy knew they were there. Stockdale knew they were there. The Helios system was operational, and the PLA's collection assets were close enough to characterize it. Here is where the geometry gets precise. PLA anti-ship missile batteries on the Fujian coast can put the strait under coverage from the YJ-12 and YJ-18 series. The YJ-18 has a range of approximately 290 miles in its anti-ship configuration, which means the entire strait transit is inside that envelope from the moment Stockdale enters. Simultaneously, PLA drone launch infrastructure in Fujian is close enough to put ISR platforms over the strait within 20 to 30 minutes of a launch decision. During the 8-day transit, the PLA conducted what U.S. Indo-Pacific Command assessed as multiple observation overflights by small unmanned platforms, operating within the parameters of what would constitute a real-world targeting and characterization mission. The PLA was rehearsing the threat that Helios is designed to defeat, and Helios was operational and watching them do it. On the flight deck, the sequence repeats: helicopter deck landing, refuel, launch again. The crew runs the evolution without breaking rhythm. That tempo is not accidental. Every movement has been rehearsed until the drill and the real thing look identical from the carrier island superstructure above. Here is what most analysis of this deployment missed. The conventional reading of a Taiwan Strait transit is that it is a freedom of navigation statement, a political message about U.S. rights and interests in international waters. That reading is correct, but it is incomplete. The 8-day duration of Stockdale's transit was not standard. A typical freedom of navigation passage through the strait takes 1 to 2 days. 8 days is deliberate dwell time. Dwell time in a contested surveillance environment means extended characterization opportunity for both sides. The Navy wanted the PLA to observe Helios in an operational posture, not in a test environment off San Diego, not in a press release. In the strait, against real PLA observation platforms, in the specific geography where the system would be employed in a conflict scenario. This is what the Navy calls a live demonstration. The PLA calls it intelligence collection. Both readings are accurate. The Navy wanted them to collect. What the PLA collected changes their targeting calculus. Here is the take that will probably generate pushback. The decision to accelerate Helios fielding on a Flight IIA before the system reached its full designed capability threshold was the right call, and the Navy should have made it 3 years earlier. Waiting for a system to mature before deploying it operationally made sense when the threat environment was stable and the PLA's swarm capability was a planning scenario rather than an observable fact. That era ended around 2022, when PLA drone exercises in the East and South China Seas demonstrated a swarm coordination capability that exceeded what most open-source threat assessments had projected for 2025. The Navy waited 3 years. The Taiwan Strait deployment in 2026 is the correction. The obstacle was not technical, it was institutional. Integrating a directed energy weapon onto an operational hull requires solving power management, thermal management, and crew qualification simultaneously, in a fleet already operating at high tempo across 3 theaters. The engineering team at Naval Surface Warfare Center, Dahlgren, ran into thermal cycling problems in the second integration phase that set the schedule back by approximately 8 months. The solution was a modified heat exchanger architecture borrowed from submarine propulsion plant cooling systems, which is not the kind of detail that makes press releases but is the reason Helios can now sustain engagement rates in the Strait's humid, salt-laden air environment. 18 months of engineering to save $4.3 million per intercept, multiplied across the life of the fleet. The math is not complicated. What do you think? Does the Navy's decision to field an imperfect directed energy system early represent sound strategic judgment, or does it risk exposing capability gaps the PLA can now engineer around? Put your answer in the comments. This is a real question with no clean answer. Now, the second-order consequences. What Stockdale did in the Strait was not the end of the strategic sequence. It was the beginning of a new one. The PLA now knows 3 things it did not know before this deployment. First, Helios is real, operational, and sea deployed, not a test article. Second, it functions in the specific environmental conditions of the Taiwan Strait: humidity, salt spray, sea state, electromagnetic background noise from PLA radar emissions. Third, it is installed on a Flight IIA hull, which means the upgrade path scales to dozens of existing ships without waiting for next-generation hull construction. Each of those data points requires a response from PLA anti-access planning. The logical PLA countermoves are limited and expensive. Option 1. Harden drone airframes against directed energy intercept by increasing the thermal resistance of sensor packages and replacing optical seekers with radar-guided terminal homing. That works, partially, but increases drone unit cost by an estimated factor of 3 to 5, which partially erases the exchange rate advantage the swarm model was built around. Option 2. Saturate beyond the engagement rate of the Helios system. A 60-kilowatt laser has a finite dwell time per target and a finite thermal budget per engagement sequence. Put more contacts in the air than the laser can cycle through in the available engagement window, and you restore the arithmetic. That requires a larger swarm, which requires more platforms, more logistics, more cost. Option 3. Target the Helios installation directly. Suppress or destroy the directed energy weapon before the swarm engagement begins. That elevates the attack's opening signature and reduces the ambiguity that gives the PLA operational flexibility in a gray zone scenario. None of these options is cheap. All of them increase the cost of an anti-ship operation against a Helios-equipped surface force. That cost increase is the strategic objective, not a single engagement, the cost curve. One detail worth sitting with. The PLA's ISR drone operators who overflew Stockdale during the Strait transit were, in effect, providing targeting data for a system that could have engaged their platforms at 0 ammunition cost. Helios was tracking them. They knew it. That knowledge is now built into every PLA planning scenario that puts an ISR drone over a U.S. surface force. The psychological dimension of a directed energy weapon is not negligible. A commander who cannot know whether his observation platform will survive its approach has to assume it may not, which changes the reliability of the ISR picture he is building before he fires. Uncertainty, at scale, degrades the PLA's kill chain. That is not a secondary effect of Helios. That is half the mission. The campaign of directed energy demonstrations was complete. The data had been collected, the signal transmitted. But what no one in Beijing's analysis community had fully priced in was what would happen to the cost calculus of the next 100 hulls that could carry this weapon. The 7th Fleet does not operate in isolation. Stockdale's transit occurred against the backdrop of a broader Indo-Pacific posture that has been reorganizing since 2023. The Philippines' IIA expansion added 4 new basing sites, including facilities at Cagayan Province and Luzon that put U.S. pre-positioned equipment inside 250 miles of Taiwan's southern coast. The Guam buildup, centered on Andersen Air Force Base and Naval Base Guam, has expanded the second island chain's capacity to sustain high-tempo strike operations. B-21 Raiders are now flying operational missions out of Whiteman Air Force Base, with the range to reach the Strait without refueling from any base in the Pacific. AUKUS is delivering Virginia-class submarine access to the Australian operating area, which extends the SSN presence in the approaches to the South China Sea without adding a single new hull to the Pacific Fleet's order of battle. The map, read in full, shows a force posture that has been reworking its geometry for 3 years. Stockdale's transit was one data point in a larger argument. The argument is that the cost of any PLA military action across the Strait is rising on multiple axes simultaneously. The defensive cost to PLA strike packages is going up as Helios scales. The PLA's ISR picture is losing confidence as directed energy weapons proliferate, and the U.S. basing network in the first island chain is deepening to the point where any PLA military action that does not immediately address shore-based U.S. capability is operating with an exposed flank. The geometry is shifting, slowly, but in a direction Beijing cannot easily reverse. Here is what does not sit right about how this deployment has been discussed in public. The commentary has mostly focused on the hardware, 60 kilowatts, engagement range, drone intercept capability. That is the wrong frame. The hardware is the instrument. The argument is the strategy. The real question the Stockdale deployment poses to Beijing is not, can your drone survive a laser? It is, if we can put this on a Flight IIA today, what is on a Flight 3 tomorrow? And if the upgrade path scales across 40-plus hulls, what does your anti-ship math look like in 2029 when Helios 2 is at sea and the power budget has doubled? The PLA is building an answer. It is expensive, and it is not finished. One unresolved variable sits at the center of this board, and neither side has answered it yet. Helios addresses the drone and terminal phase ASCM problem on the surface. It does not address the ballistic missile problem. The DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile, the carrier killer, operates in a flight regime and at a terminal velocity that no currently deployed directed energy weapon at sea can engage. The SM-3 Block IIA is the intercept answer for that threat, but it requires an Aegis-equipped hull to be in the right geometry at the right time, and the ballistic missile's terminal velocity narrows that window to seconds. The Stockdale deployment shows the Navy has a credible answer for the low end of the A2 Davos. The high end remains a contested problem, and Beijing knows the distinction. The second variable plays out on the water, not the deck. Freedom of navigation patrols push through international waters, the carrier wake cutting a line across the Pacific. The MH-60 Seahawk lifts off the deck and extends the patrol radius, reaching toward coastlines where shore-based radar tracks every pass. The geometry of first island chain coverage depends on where those helicopters can land, where those ships can refuel, where that carrier can put to pier. Without forward access, the flight deck operations, the submarine hunt sorties, the naval gunfire support runs, all of it compresses back toward the open ocean horizon, out of range of the waters that matter most. Will the directed energy upgrade path outpace the PLA's countermeasures before the political architecture of the first island chain comes under greater strain? Comment yes or no. We will be reading. Now you know who USS Stockdale's transit was really for. It was not for the governments in Taipei or Manila or Tokyo, though all of them were watching. It was not primarily for the crews of the PLA maritime patrol vessels and AGIs that shadowed the ship for 8 days. It was for the analysts and planners in Beijing who spend their careers building kill chains against U.S. surface forces, and who now have to update every anti-ship scenario they have ever modeled to account for a laser on a 30-year-old hull class that numbers in the dozens. The most important thing Stockdale demonstrated was not what Helios can kill. It is what Helios does to the cost structure of every weapon system the PLA has designed to threaten U.S. surface forces in the Strait. Each drone that now has to be hardened, each swarm that now has to be larger to achieve the same saturation probability, each ISR platform whose approach can no longer be assumed survivable. Every one of those represents a cost imposed on the PLA's anti-ship investment without a single round fired. The board favors the United States today in the directed energy competition in the Strait, but this board is changing, and the PLA is building its answer. The timeline for that answer is compressed, and the answer will be expensive. How expensive and how fast is the variable that decides the next iteration of this deployment. USS Stockdale returned to Yokosuka. The Helios system logged its hours. The strait is 110 miles wide, and the geometry of it has not changed. What changed is one number in Beijing's targeting calculus, the cost of the first shot. On the carrier deck, every defensive missile fired costs tens of thousands of dollars. Every intercept demands crew time, logistics chains, replenishment runs across open ocean. The adversary counts on that math, launch enough, and the defender bleeds dry before the attacker does.